From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening and welcome. Before we begin, I would like us to take a minute of silence to reflect upon the thanks that we owe to Gustavo Garcia, Carlos Cadena, James de Anda, Chris Aldrete, and John Herrera for what they did as a team, appealing the case of Hernandez versus Texas, and who are truly pioneers of American civil rights, and who secured for us all a more perfect justice. First, I would like to thank all of you for being here tonight. Our special thanks to Judge Tagle and Ms. Villalobos for so readily, graciously, and selflessly accepting my invitation. We are also very grateful to Mr. Dysart, the Deputy Librarian of Congress, for accepting to speak on behalf of this wonderful institution. Our executive sponsors, Roberta Schaefer, Maite Arce, President of Hispanic Access Foundation, Robert Randolph Newland, the USDA chapter of Hispanic American Cultural Effort, David Dominguez, and Maria Perez Morales. These sorts of projects are only possible by the collective efforts, and no contribution is ever too small. And the following also gave very selflessly: Dr. Mark Grover, Gustavo Guerra, Norma Gutierrez, and Sandra Sawicki. And all of those people who remain behind the scenes are equally important: Ryan Bedford, Wendy Carrasco, Ida Hernandez, Jared McNeil, Kirk Rasco, Alex Rodriguez, Andres Romero, and Nichelle Wingfield. And last but not least, to the very best board members and advisory council an organization could ever have. Please stand. And I ask that the audience join me in applauding their efforts. So the board members, would you please stand? Thank you. This evening's events come from a call to action that came to me when I attended a Black History Month event here at the Library of Congress. One of the guest speakers admonished the audience that if they wanted to preserve and promote their history, they would have to take an active role in it, because it is not the responsibility of other cultures to be the curators of our cultural patrimony. Moved by the admonishment, as chance would have it, I was looking for the role of Hispanics in the civil rights movement. Immediately, this little-known case came to the surface. It was rich with all the trappings of an epic of our people. Many of you may know that Hispanic people have been involved in the civil rights movement since 1903. This evening, as we listen to the presentations that our special guests will deliver, ask yourself if you've done your part to learn about the collective American history, and have you shared it? Texas today is a richly diverse state. I say that with some boastful enthusiasm. As I was born in Mexico, but raised in South Texas, it is a place that I love. What people will notice when they go to Texas is that due to syncretism, Anglo-Celtic folks of those regions, without hesitation, use the words arroyo or resaca instead of dry river, bed, or creek. It's not uncommon to attend an Anglo-Celtic home where the main holiday meals are pozole, tamales, and champurrado, or to find a Hispanic home having beef Wellington or shepherd's pie. The integration has taken place, and our cultures are inextricable. from one another. There will always be exceptions, but we no longer are a people divided. Other places in the country, perhaps because of lack of exposure, are still a bit divided. Adversity is not our plight. We should collectively seek to bring out the best in one another, as Americans all. Tonight is a celebration of the work that great Americans before us, who happen to be Hispanics, did to secure perfected justice for us all. Thank you. And one small note, one of the attorneys who was involved in appealing this case to the Supreme Court is represented here tonight by the granddaughter, and Hannah, if you'll please stand up. She is the granddaughter of Carlos Cadena. Thank you for being here. And now, please join me in welcoming the Deputy Librarian of Congress, Mr. Robert Deiser, Jr.
Thank you, sir. Okay. Thank you, Francisco. And I join Francisco and all my colleagues from the Library of Congress who are here tonight to welcome you to the library. Here, in addition to supporting the Congress and fulfilling its constitutional responsibilities, we record the history and creative work of the American people. I'm happy to join with you tonight in remembering and gaining greater insight into one of the more important events in our history. As Francisco said, Hernandez v. Texas, a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case for American civil rights, but also in particular for Latino American civil rights. This evening, it really is my pleasure to introduce our two speakers, each of whom will deliver a talk commemorating that case. Presenting first is the Honorable Hilda G. Tagle, the senior U.S. District Court judge for the Southern District of Texas, the Brownsville Division. Judge Tagle was the first Hispanic woman in Texas to hold the position of federal district judge. And prior to her 1997 appointment, sorry, I just aged you 20 years there, just in a slip of a tongue, 1997 appointment to the federal bench by President Clinton. She served as the Nueces County Court Judge and on the state's 148th District Court. She has also provided legal counsel to city and county governments and was an assistant district attorney in Nueces County. Our second speaker is Veronica Villalobos, Director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. Ms. Villalobos manages OPM's government-wide diversity effort to develop, drive, and monitor strategies and initiatives designed to create a more diverse and inclusive federal workforce. And I must confess, I lifted that last sentence in whole from your official biography because I really like that trio of verbs of develop, drive, and monitor, which is a great combination. So, and with your permission, I'm going to look for opportunities to use those three, and I'm sure I'm going to have them really soon. Earlier in her career, Ms. Villalobos worked at the U.S. Equal Opportunity Employment Commission as one of the agency's first honor program attorneys. She has served in the federal government senior executive service since October 2010. Tonight, we touch on the 60th anniversary of Hernandez v. Texas, a case, as we mentioned, before the High Court, whose ruling, based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, held that the amendment requires non-discrimination by race not only for white or black persons, but also for persons of other classes, including people of Hispanic descent. This was also the first case to be litigated in the Supreme Court by Hispanic individuals. And we're very happy to welcome you today as a granddaughter of one of the participants in the case. This commemorative event is particularly timely, as this year the library and many other institutions, not only in Washington but around the country, will mark the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So again, welcome Judge and Ms. Villalobos and everyone here tonight. We're happy to have you here, and I look forward to your talks. Thank you.
Okay. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Hilda G. Tagle, Senior Judge of the U.S. District of the Southern District of Texas.
Just remind me, in case I get so excited about what my remarks and the chronology of events, that I forget to put this picture into my talk. First of all, I want to thank Francisco. He hasn't disclosed to me yet how it is that he found me. I was thrilled to get a call from him. My assistant or somebody told me that somebody from the Library of Congress had called, and I said, oh boy, they're going to appoint me to the Oliver Wendell Holmes devise. But that's okay. You know, I was asked to, it was even better that I was asked to speak on Hernandez versus Texas. And let me tell you, the sources for this talk include A Class Apart, a PBS documentary that some of you have mentioned tonight that you've seen recently or in the past. It also includes, one of my sources is a book edited by Michael Olivas. He is a professor of law at the University of Houston Law Center. This book was published in connection with the 50th anniversary of Hernandez versus Texas, and it's titled Colored Men and Hombres Aquí, Hernandez versus Texas and the Emergence of Mexican-American Lawyering. I also I was surprised when I was reading the material to find reference, or one of the documents that was reproduced was an order in connection with a case involving Gregorio Cortez, who was, I don't know whether any of you have ever seen a movie called The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez, that stars Edward James Olmos, who, by the way, was a narrator of A Class Apart. But in connection with the very issue that was raised in Hernandez versus Texas, as well as a previous case out of Fort Bend County, an adjacent county to Jackson County, in which Judge De Anda and John Herrera, who were lawyers at the time from Houston, participated in. But first of all, let me give you some context. There's first of all, in connection with the ballad of Gregorio Cortez, one of the things that was reproduced in this book, edited by Professor Olivas, is actually not an order, but an article in the Dallas Morning News, but that told about the attorneys for Gregorio Cortez filing a motion to quash the indictment on the basis that the grand jury returning the indictment for murder discriminated against the Mexican race. That's how it was described in the article. So when the events that led to this case came about, it was after World War II, in which it's estimated about 500,000 Mexican-American and Puerto Rican or Hispanic origin men served in the armed forces. And I've read, and I haven't seen the footnote yet that tells me with complete authority that it's true, or that this is accurate, that Mexican Americans earn more Congressional Medals of Honor for bravery and valor than any other identifiable group. So having now returning from fighting for this country, they found themselves, especially in South Texas, where there tended to be a greater population of Mexican Americans, they found themselves being treated like second-class citizens. As an example, Private Felix Longoria from Three Rivers, who had died in action in World War II, his body was refused for burial by the funeral home in Three Rivers. And the family, seeking help, found Dr. Hector P. Garcia, a medical doctor who had served as an officer in the U.S. Army, and he took it upon himself to help the family with the situation, and ultimately Felix Longoria was buried here in Arlington Cemetery. But that's an example of how people of the Mexican race, as the Dallas Morning News described us, what the conditions were. As a result of that experience, Dr. Hector Garcia founded an organization called the American GI Forum to educate veterans about their rights to an education, medical services, and help with housing. And another organization that was founded around that time was the League of United Latin American Citizens, that's LULAC, an advocacy group for Mexican American civil rights. Schools and cemeteries were segregated. The Texas Restaurant Association promulgated a sign that restaurant owners could put up in their restaurants that said, "No Mexicans, niggers, or dogs allowed." The events that led up to this litigation occurred in Jackson County, which in 1950 had a population of 13,000. In the context of this events, in 1953 was the first time, the first black woman was admitted to practice law in Texas. In November 1954 was the first time that a woman was allowed to serve on a jury in Texas. Even though Sarah T. Hughes, who was the federal judge who swore in Lyndon Baines Johnson as president, she had been a state district judge since 1931. So the irony being that she could preside over a trial, a jury trial, but she could not serve as a juror in her own courtroom, because it was not until 1954 that women were allowed to serve on juries. And it was in 1955 that the first Hispanic woman lawyer in Texas was licensed, Edna Cisneros from Raymondville. And this is a picture of me. This is also context. This was taken in 1950-51 when I was at St. Anthony's Catholic School, all greñuda with dientes podridos. But so, here we were in South Texas just trying to get traction on the rights that others took for granted throughout the rest of the United States. Also, let me remind you that, or if in case you did not know, you had to pay a poll tax to be able to vote. In fact, I think the poll tax for national elections was abolished in 1964, and in Texas, it was abolished for state elections in 1966. So let me remind you that how grand juries were selected and how juries were selected. Texas had a system at the time of grand jury commissioners. They were the ones who appointed their friends to serve on the grand jury. In fact, the events that led to Hernandez being charged with murder occurred on August 4th, 1951, and he was indicted August 4th, 1951. That was for grand jurors who, I'm sure you know, are the ones who determine whether there's sufficient evidence to formally charge a person with a crime, with a felony. As a matter of fact, the American GI Forum was, one of their functions was to raise money to help people pay their poll taxes so they could vote, because to be able to to be called for jury duty, you had to be a registered voter. And you couldn't be a registered voter until you could pay a poll tax. So that was another way that a lot of people who were of limited means, who were struggling to feed a family and to survive, did not have the luxury of being able to vote without paying a certain price. I don't remember now what it used to be, but regardless, like I said, even though the GI Forum raised money for scholarships, part of what they did was to raise money to help people pay poll tax. And as a matter of fact, when the appeal of Hernandez versus Texas was going on, LULAC and American GI Forum, they're the ones who funded the process, because it takes money to file it's a filing fee to file an appeal or petition for writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court. You have to pay for printing and binding, and of course you have the lawyer's time and support staff. So as a matter of fact, they had this appeal throughout the country. Dr. Hector Garcia had a radio show that was broadcast throughout the United States, And he just asked people, he appealed to them to send money to help these lawyers in the appeal of this case. So what happened was that there was really no question that Pete Hernandez killed Joe Espinosa in Edna, Jackson County, Texas, on August 4th, 1951. The grand jury, as I said, indicted him that very same day. I mean, talk about speedy justice. There was no speedy trial issues in that case, because then they had the trial in October of that same year, October 8th through October 11th, and he was convicted. But first of all, the grand jury that indicted him had no Mexican Americans on that jury, that grand jury, and neither were there any Mexican Americans on the Pettit jury, the trial jury. And so the lawyers who represented him, Pete Hernandez, included Justice Carlos Cadena, and by the way, Hannah Katz, that's her name, and she's his granddaughter. She works for Congressman Joaquin Castro. So I'm so happy that you're here, because, I really got chills when she told me who she was. But Carlos Cadena and Gus Garcia were from San Antonio. James de Anda and Johnny Herrera were from Houston. And they were so afraid of the people of Edna that they used to drive home every night. Every time there was a hearing or during the trial, they would drive home every night and come back the next day. So for Gus Garcia and Judge Cadena, they drove 300 miles round trip from Edna to San Antonio and back. And for Johnny Herrera and Judge De Anda, it was a 200-mile round trip. I talk about dedication. In fact, at one point, I learned that the judge in the court asked the lawyers if they needed an interpreter. You can imagine. So in pretrial motions, as in the case of Gregorio Cortez, the defense moved to quash the indictment and to quash the veneer. That means the indictment, because it was returned by a grand jury that had no Mexican Americans, and the veneer being the panel of people who get called to be for the purpose of jury selection. And of course, those motions were denied. But the basis for it was the fact that there was the evidence that they put on was that there had been, in 25 years, there had never been any Mexican American who had ever served on a grand jury or on a trial jury in Jackson County. So they also called other witnesses, including a man who tried to put his, well, like I said, the schools were also segregated. There were the Mexican schools, and I'm sure that there were the black schools, and there were the white schools. Well, his son was able to speak English, and he wanted to put him in a school with people who already knew English. But in spite of the fact that his son could speak English, he was told that no, that he had to go to the Mexican school. And they put on all different kinds of evidence like that. But one of the things that they learned and they had testimony about was the fact that even the bathrooms, and when I was growing up, I remember the water fountains, colored and white. And of course, I couldn't figure out which one then. I wasn't white for sure, but my definition or my idea of colored was not somebody who looked like me. So anyway, so when one of the lawyers asked a worker at the courthouse in Jackson County where the men's bathroom was, they said, well, you have to go over there. Not the men's bathroom in the courthouse, but apparently something around outside in the basement. And there was a sign above the bathroom door that said, colored men and hombres aquí. In other words, in Spanish, men here. So that was part of the evidence that the attorneys put on before the trial judge in connection with their motion to quash the indictment. So, and actually I had experienced some kind of experience like that myself in the early 80s. Even when I was an assistant county attorney, I was given a project to find out who the grand jury commissioners were or had been for a period of time in Nueces County. And I learned that Robstown, which is the second largest town in Nueces County, there had never been a grand jury commissioner from Robstown. And it's predominantly Mexican-American town. The grand jury commissioners used to come from Corpus Christi, which is a county seat, but also farming communities like Bishop and Banquete and Driscoll, and then a town of Port Aransas. So, even in the 1980s, we still had, commissioners who only would appoint their friends, people that they knew, and who are they going to be, other people like them. So, so back to Hernandez, I'm digressing. So the trial court's decision was affirmed by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. The U.S. Supreme Court accepted their petition for writ of certiorari, and they accepted it even though there were two procedural flaws. One, it was filed a day late, and it was not printed and bound, it was typed. But for whatever reason, they were allowed to proceed. And as has been said, there was the first time that the U.S. Supreme Court was addressed by a Mexican lawyer. One of them, the one who started the address to the court, was Justice Carlos Cadena. Justice Cadena is videotaped saying that he began with, "Your petitioner is an American citizen of Mexican descent." And one of the Supreme Court justices asked, "What's that?" And then one of the justices also said, "They call them greasers down there, don't they?" And another question that was asked to them was, "Can Mexican Americans speak English?" So in spite of such an inauspicious start to the oral argument, the Supreme Court did reverse the conviction and remanded it for retrial, finding that Mexican Americans, although not of the black race, were treated as a class apart and were therefore protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So Hernandez, as you know, was the first Mexican-American civil rights case to reach the U.S. Supreme Court. But let me I want to end with giving you a little bit of more personal information about these lawyers. Carlos Cadena went on to become professor of law at St. Mary's Law School, and then he went on to serve on the Court of Appeals based out of San Antonio, and at one time becoming Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals. Judge James De Anda practiced law in Houston, continued to practice law in Houston and then Corpus Christi, and filed several civil rights cases in Corpus Christi. And he was ultimately appointed to the Southern District of Texas by President Jimmy Carter in 1979. I had the pleasure of knowing Judge De Anda. He had already retired as a judge, because I'm from the Southern District of Texas. But I had the pleasure of hearing him tell, his version of how things happened in connection with not only the practice of law. He graduated from Texas A&M, gotten a law degree. He said he couldn't get a job when he first got out of law school, and he couldn't get a job in Houston. But he wound up meeting Johnny Herrera, who said, "Yes, come on in," and which is the fate of a lot of lawyers, even today, who are either solo practitioners or take government positions, and because they still have the doors of some of the law firms are still very firmly closed. But John Herrera, who was one of the lawyers from Houston, he had an interesting beginning. He worked for the sanitation department of the city of Houston while he was in law school, and he loved to tell about it. And because he could really identify with people and their suffering when he represented them. And in fact, I learned that he took the bar 6 or 7 times, and rather than being ashamed of it, he was kind of proud of it, that he was perseverant and finally passed. And actually, he was very proud of a letter of congratulations that he received from the bar examiners, congratulating him on his tenacity and finally passing the bar. He framed it and had it displayed in his office, I'm told. The one sad note to all of this was the brilliant orator Gus Garcia, who was one of the lawyers from San Antonio, although he was extremely talented in the art of advocacy. He was a dazzling public speaker, and something of quite a bit of pride in connection with this case is the fact that the Supreme Court, when his time was up, by the way, my timekeeper said she was going to hold me to it, when the time on the lectern at the Supreme Court went on, the red light went on, which is the signal that you're supposed to stop even if it's mid-word or mid-sentence, that he was given 12 more minutes to speak, which is really unheard of. But sadly, with all of this talent and brilliance, he died, basically of alcoholism and complications with mental health issues, and he died on a park bench in San Antonio. But for that time and for that place, we were fortunate to have 4 men and others. There were others who helped with the briefing, and of course all of the people, somebody, I guess it was Justice Cadena who was interviewed, or maybe John Herrera's son, who said people would just come and give them coins and dollar bills to be able to contribute to the fund to help them. That's before, there was such a thing as MALDEF, to help pay for the expenses of this appeal. And what's even sadder today is that as important as Brown versus Board of Education is, actually Hernandez versus Texas was decided just a few days before Brown versus Board of Education. And I heard a speaker on Law Day today talking about Brown versus Board of Education and not even mentioning in connection with civil rights, Hernandez versus Texas. But in spite of that, I think that these men were courageous, and we owe them a big debt of gratitude. Thank you so much for inviting me. And by the way, I want to acknowledge my husband, Eddie Knabel. He traveled with me to this conference, and I'm so happy that he's here to support me. And my friend Elaine Cummings, my friend from Corpus Christi. Thank you so much. Don't you think this is a good picture? I love this picture. I told my first husband when I was running for office in Corpus Christi, I said, if I ever get too full of myself, just show me this picture.
All right. Thank you very much, Judge Tagle. You definitely gave us some things that we will definitely ponder. Now we're happy to introduce Veronica Villalobos. She is the Director of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the Office of Personnel Management.
Good evening. So I'm going to start by telling you I'm really excited to be here and almost have so many different things floating in my head. I'm hoping they all come together in a meaningful way, because so rarely do we get the opportunity to talk about these types of issues in the work that we do in the federal government, right? So you get excited and you think not only of your own personal history, not only of the history of your people, not only of the history of civil rights in the United States, but then you think about the thing that happened to you last week. You think about what's happening across the federal government, and you just get so excited, and I'm afraid I'm going to think of all these things, and I won't make a bit of sense to anyone in the room. So I'll look for the cues from you, those nonverbals telling me that it all fits together. One thing that really always strikes me when we talk about civil rights is oftentimes we forget that this is the history of every person who's in the United States. What will sometimes happen is we separate it into periods. We separate it into the period before the United States was a nation. We'll separate it into the history of a state, because that's how we learn in our different schools. I'm also from Texas. I'm from El Paso, and so we had Texas history. We separate it into the immigrant populations and when they came in and when they stopped being so ethnic, or they stopped being different or minority. And now we say people of color. And I one time had a friend who is not a minority herself, and she said, people of color, well, what is it? I thought people didn't want to be colored people, so now they're people of color? She thought she was being funny, and I thought, oh, shut up. I didn't say that, but that's what I thought, right? Because there is a certain sense, if you're not of the community, if you haven't lived the different parts of those histories, if you haven't heard it from your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and the struggles, it doesn't mean the same thing to you. I was just talking when I came in about a story that my mom used to tell about my brother. My brother's 15 years older than me. And she got a call from the teacher. And the teacher said, "Your son is doing terribly, and he doesn't speak a word of English." And you'll get the punchline as we go, but she said, "Let me come right in." You know, she's a stay-at-home mom, and she came in and she said, "Point out my son to me," at the top of the class. And she pointed him out. And she said, "Yeah, I knew you didn't know who my son was. I have problems because I can barely get him to speak Spanish," right? But that still has ramifications today. I heard another story just coming up, and I'll use it without a name, but it was the situation where someone has a Spanish last name, and it was assumed when they started school that they didn't speak any English. And we still experience that. In the work that we do in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, what we've been asked to do is to create a more representative government. We look at our federal workforce and we think this work is important because we create the policies that get implemented across this nation, no matter what language you speak, no matter what community you come from. And the question is, how can we truly work for the people if we're not of the people and we don't know what those experiences are every day? And that's been our work, to look at the diversity of the United States and to say, how do we create a federal workforce that can implement policy that touches the lives of the people with knowledge, with experience, and with compassion? And that's why we do the work that we do. Now, if you look at the entire federal workforce across the board and we look at the numbers, Hispanics and people with disabilities are the only two groups that are underrepresented across the workforce. But let me say that this with a caveat. It depends on which of the agencies you're looking at. Because there are agencies that have severe underrepresentation for African Americans, or for African American men, or for people with disabilities, or Asians. And so that first number, that first glance, it doesn't tell you the whole story. And this is really the future of civil rights. It's about taking all of the diversity, not expecting us to always get along, not expecting that it's always going to be, the best product because of our diversity of thought, but taking all of those talents and knowing that through the struggle of working together, we will get better products. We will get more diversity. There's a professor, Scott Page. Don't know if any of you have ever read his book, The Difference. He's from the University of Michigan. And if you ever get to hear him speak, if you can ever go on YouTube and look and hear him speak about this, he came up with a mathematical theorem that shows that the more diversity you have, the better able you are to solve problems. Because it makes perfect sense, right? Our diversity of experience coming together gives us more intelligence, more knowledge than that one smartest person in the room. And that's what we're asking across the government that agencies consider when they do their outreach and recruitment. Now, what does this have to do with a case from many, many years ago? It is about representation. It's about who's at the table, who's making the decisions, be it a jury, be it a boardroom, or be it a policy meeting talking about how we're going to provide services. What I will further say about that is it's very interesting. If any of you get a chance to even just read some of the literature around this case, there was a long discussion about whether Hispanics were white or whether, they didn't fall into the category of black. So what is the identity there? And there's also a long discussion about, throughout the literature, around people of Indo-white ancestry, right? And how we self-identify even today. I have friends who will not identify on any of these forms because they say to me, I don't feel like I'm white, and they list Hispanic as an ethnicity, and that's not who I am. And so I will tell you that even today, our data suffers from the fact that people are not comfortable with how they have to self-identify on a government form, be it when they're first applying to a job in the federal government, be it once they are actually selected, or be it just to fill out a census form, because they don't feel connected to the identity that is listed on government forms even today. I remember being a little girl, and my grandfather on my mom's side would talk about himself, and he'd always call himself a Chicano. And I didn't have a connection to that name. I was born a little bit later, and so that didn't seem to mean anything to me, because I grew up really in the 80s, and so to me all these concepts seemed 1,000 years ago, right? Because when you're young, 5 years is 1,000,000 years ago. And I remember thinking, okay, Chicano. So I said this to my father, my biological father, and he said, oh, no, we're Mexican American. And this case of Hernandez really touches on that very issue too, around identity and how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us. And even today, we see those kinds of issues that come up for the community. Now, we work very closely with the agencies on implementing diversity and inclusion strategic plans. And this was something that came out of an executive order by the president in 2011 on establishing a coordinated effort on diversity and inclusion. And what I can tell you is some agencies are really putting all their effort into it, and other agencies still don't get it. They don't know why we're doing this. And so I hope that some of you in this room can be advocates. How many of you are federal employees? Some of you? If you can be advocates within your agency explaining why this is such an important piece. I'll give you a real quick example, Library of Congress. Why it would be so important to have people from diverse backgrounds, from diverse ethnicities in this agency is that it's the story of the United States, of all of its people. And those who have heritages that are drawn from that rich history are going to see it from different angles, have different perceptions of it. One thing that we've also worked very hard on is applicant flow data. How are we going to track who's even applying for the jobs? And I won't bore you with this history. I think it's the most fascinating thing. I recently went to talk to data people, and I started telling them the policy story, thinking they would love it because they're data people, and I could see their eyes just glaze over. But applicant flow data was something that in the 80s, the Office of Personnel Management told agencies you have to collect. And this is before we were doing anything with computers. So you can imagine it was a paper form that just got disconnected from your application, and somebody sat there and counted one by one. Well, now we get thousands and tens of thousands of applications through USA Jobs. And we hadn't been collecting applicant flow data. EEOC stepped in the early 2000s and said, folks, you need to be doing this. And they sort of got ignored until our director, Barry, who was placed in there by President Obama, said, no, this is silly. We need to know who's applying for jobs. So now we're actually collecting applicant flow data. Significant because we need to make sure we're drawing from all the talents in every community. And then once we do that, who's reviewing those applications? What are they looking for? If you've never been in government, do you even know how to apply for a government job? How to even speak the government language that will make you rise to the top as a highly qualified individual? Those are the things that we're looking at. Then further in, who is reviewing the after the application is reviewed, who reviews it again and decides we want to interview you? And then who's on that selection panel to decide whether you fit in to that organization? I'll give you a quick example. When I was an attorney at EEOC, I miss being an attorney. My husband makes fun of me because he says I'm HR now. I refuse to say that's true. But when I was an attorney, I had a case, and it was a gentleman who was in Texas, Latino. I could tell from what I was reading that he probably spoke with a pretty thick Spanish accent. And he had applied for 15 director positions with an agency. He had been acting director at different times during his career. over the course of about 5 years as he kept applying for these jobs, job after job. What's also part of the record is that he was myopic. He had one eye that he would wear a patch sometimes, or sometimes he would wear the glass eye. And for 15 cases, the agency defended the non-selection of this individual, despite the fact that he'd act very frequently for long periods of time, 180-day details, where everyone thought he did a fine job. But they would never select him for it. And one thing that became very clear as we looked at that file is that the panelists were made up of all white men, non-Hispanic, and they would state things like, he didn't seem confident enough. He wouldn't look up when we would ask questions. Well, as some of you may know, in parts of the Hispanic culture, it's not appropriate to look someone in the eye who is considered to be of a higher level than yourself, or, in rank. It's appropriate to look down. But one of the things they criticize, add to this, folks, did you remember I said he had a glass eye? I mean, that might have also had something to do with who he was looking at in the room as he's being interviewed, right? We ended up finding discrimination on one of the 15 non-selections because the agency failed to give a legitimate non-discriminatory reason. They didn't give any reason. I think he just kind of kept filing case after case. Now let me say this, we couldn't tell from the file whether he was the best qualified for the job. That didn't become something that was very clear to us. It never is, right? But his tenacity and the fact that there were these stray comments around the way he spoke English, his accent, the fact that when they did need someone to act in other positions, they would put him in readily, that told us something about that case, and we were able to find discrimination. But those things still happen. Now, I most recently had something happen to me, and I hadn't had anything happen in so long that I forgot, right? You forget, because you go along in your life and everyone treats you like as well or as badly as they treat everyone else, so you figure, oh, things are good, right? For my birthday, my husband took me to Turks and Caicos. This was just a couple weeks ago, and it was amazing. And if anyone has ever thought of going, you have to go. It's fabulous. And I'm so excited about it, I still talk about it like it just happened. But I came back, and we were talking about how we had to go all the time. I mean, I'm even thinking we should move here, right? And we get to the airport. And I have my last name. I didn't take my husband's last name. And, oops, sorry. They flag me for extra security. And I thought that was a little bit strange, but that's all right. So we go back, and they go through all of my luggage, make sure there's nothing in there that shouldn't be there. And then they said, you're going to have to go through extra security again when you get through that first level. So they're very nice, and they send us through, and we go, and I go through, and I get screened. And then I got patted down, like I've never gotten patted down before in my life. And then I thought, okay, we're done. And they went through my purse again, and they went through every camera, and I had to take out the batteries. And I thought, I'm done. All right, so now I get to get on the plane. Well, guess what happens right before I get on the plane? They pull me aside again to pat me down again and to go through my purse all over again and to turn on all my electronics. So I'm annoyed, and I said, this is silly, you already did it. But I go back, and I get in the plane, and I'm feeling good again, and I think, well, I should have had a slightly better attitude, but, it was a frustrating experience. And then I get to Miami, and guess what happens? Same thing all over again. And when I got into the last line, this was probably the third time now in the United States that I'm getting checked, I look around myself, and I look to my right, and there is an Asian woman, 2 Hispanics, and 5 blacks in that line. And I look in front of me, and there's a Hispanic woman with her white non-Hispanic husband, and 2 Hispanic men, and then me. And so I turned to the woman because I couldn't help it, and I said, it's a little strange because I'm in this line, and all I see around me are people of color. What also kind of set me off is that I could see people with British passports going down a center line much faster than the rest of us. And she got very defensive. And I understand, they're just doing their job, but it was frustrating. And she said, no, there are other people around here. And then the people who come up behind me, they all look very, white, Caucasian, non-Hispanic, and then they start speaking and they speak German. So I thought, wait, I think they're proving my case. I got up to the front of that line finally, and apparently the man who was going to go through my things again heard me ask. And so he started asking me, so what do you do? And I said, I'm an attorney, because I still have my bar, right, my 2 bars. And he said, oh, really? For who? And I said, the federal government. And he wanted to know more about my job, and I proceeded to tell him, and he said, well, do you have your credentials with you? And I didn't. I left it because it was a picture ID. I left it at home, and I said, but you can look me up online. And while I stood there, he did. He looked me up online to see whether the story was true. I tell you this story because maybe it was random. Maybe it was just a bad luck day, and I just kept getting pulled aside. But I'll tell you, even my husband, who normally doesn't think that's what was going on, kind of thought that's might be what had happened, right? I kind of got pulled aside because of my surname and how I looked. So those are the things that people still have happen to them. And one thing that I thought of is, imagine being a man of color. Because I saw the faces of the 2 men who were in front of me when I made the comment, and I could see that they just felt dejected, that this was the norm for them, but they couldn't say a word. And those things are still happening, and we forget sometimes. The work of our predecessors is so important because it changes the way we all see the world. I mean, just think about what's happened in the NBA this week. These are things we would have never seen even 10 years ago. Likely it would have all been brushed under the rug and no one would have said anything. And things are getting better. But we each have a responsibility to continue to do our very best for each other, to continue to find ways to improve policies within our organizations, and to do things that within our community will make a difference. The president just signed an initiative, or implemented an initiative, My Brother's Keeper, and it's specifically aimed at boys and young men of color. Because when we look at the statistics, these are the communities that have the most difficulty with education, with employment, with incarceration rates. And one of our pieces as OPM and doing personnel management is we want, as a federal government, for us to really nurture the volunteerism and to work with our communities and to make sure that we show options to our youth of all the things we can be, right? And all the things that we are already. And that's what falls upon each of us. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I really wanted to tell you, since I get to say whatever I want. The last thing I'll say is I should give you the numbers, because that'll really speak to the starkness of it all, right? If I look at the private sector, civilian labor force, we're looking at about 15 to 17% Latino. If I look at the federal government, it's 8.2%. Okay? And if I look at this senior executive service, you're going to see half of that, 4.1% in the SES. And those are the stark numbers that are the reality of a community that has been frustrated with this process and has been at the table talking about these representation issues since the 70s, right? Because I think before the 70s, people weren't really advocating as much for that federal employment spot. But since the 70s, Nixon actually convened that first commission to start looking at the issue of Spanish surnamed representation in federal employment. And here's where we are. Final story, because stories are fun, and I have a little bit more time, right? When I was at the EEOC, I was given the privilege of serving during Katrina. We're right after Katrina. And I was over in Texas serving the communities that were affected. And that's another example. It's always such a stark realization when you're there and you're hearing people's stories of the discrimination they've experienced. And so I went to a commission meeting to talk about what I had seen and to remind everyone of why we do the kind of work we do in civil rights. And when I finished that, I had a friend tell me that he got on the elevator and someone said to him, "Oh my, she's so articulate. That we're so impressed. She was just so fabulous." And he was African American, and it made him really angry. And he said, "She should be articulate. She's an attorney." He said that's all he could think to say. And he got out of the elevator. It wasn't even his floor, and he let the door shut behind him. But I tell you that because that's another piece of it too, right? We need to advocate for each other and protect each other in all of our different groups. And so when people say things that almost sound like compliments, but they're really not, be there with the smart remark too, right? When someone says something derogatory about someone in your group or another group, think about what you can say to help educate them in a way that leaves them speechless. Because until we continue to do this and work on these issues together, like I said before, we're going to continue to see it just change. Some of the agencies, for example, have had to do a lot of work in the Arab community. And I do see some of these other issues as growing and becoming part of how we talk about diversity in America. So with that, thank you for taking the time. I know you probably all want to go home now, so thanks for letting me talk and hearing my story.
Well, I hope all of you all have been as illuminated as I have. Both of those were wonderful presentations. Thank you for coming. We weren't expecting this because I didn't want either one of our speakers to feel compelled to answer anything off the cuff that may compromise their positions. However, Veronica has accepted to take questions from the public if anyone has any burning question that they need to have answered. So I'm going to ask her to step on back up here. And then after that, we'll just move to a little closure. So I ask that you bear with us for just a bit, please.
Well, no one's saying anything.
Do we have any questions? The gentleman over there.
First of all, thanks so much for the presentation. It's certainly inspiring. I know how passionate you are about this topic. So you mentioned about the underrepresentation of minorities, and I have the same discussion with friends, and the issue about, for instance, Hispanics not being represented, and the response is, well, they're just not applying, right? Or they're just not prepared enough. That kind of thing. What's your thinking in terms of that? How would you respond?
Yeah.
To people thinking that?
So the exciting news is that's actually not what we're seeing at all. What we are seeing is that Latinos are applying for the jobs, but let me say this is the caveat. We did a pretty extensive sampling in 2013 to see what is the data looking like. And of those who self-identified, 18% identified as Latino, and 15% made the qualified list, and 15% got through the process, and 15% got selected, which is exactly what we would want to see. Now, the one thing I do see with the data and the problem I have now, and the more that we look at it, we were focusing on program manager positions and those kinds of roles that require kind of a broad type of degree, right? 4-year degree, and you can likely get into one of these positions. What we haven't done is looked at some of the more technical positions to see what that applicant flow is looking like, and also to see what that selection rate looks like. VA, and they've said this in public forums with media there, so I think it's okay to say it, they did extensive research on their applicant flow, and what they found is Hispanics were slightly less likely to be selected if they appeared on a list than all other groups. And so what they have done over the course of the last 12 months is extensive work with their hiring managers. If someone was going to hire, they did work with them to address these types of issues, and now their data is looking more like the government-wide data. Are they applying? Yes. There is one problem that I do think we're going to have, and it's going to continue to be a problem until we get through probably the next 5 years, and then I think we're going to be on the other side of it. Education. Hispanics were dropping out of school at such a rate that we were having a hard time finding them. Not that they weren't there, they were there and they were applying, but there were certain types of degrees that they weren't getting, right? The STEM fields, which are very popular. We weren't seeing a lot of Latinos in STEM. Some of the other technical fields like that. Well, that's not the case anymore. In the last 2 years, the dropout rates have dropped in half. There's a Pew study on this. Students are now enrolled in colleges and universities at 15% Latinos. Now we've got to make sure that they graduate, right? And that they're getting degrees in areas that are going to be useful to them. But what I see is we're going in the right direction, and we're going to see these numbers improve in all of the fields. So that's no longer going to be that occupational argument, oh, where there just aren't enough Latinos in finance. So.
Veronica, I heard you draw this parallel, and correct me if I'm wrong, but with Hernandez versus Texas, the issue, as we understood, was that there was no jury of your peers. Much like a selection panel is the jury. So in the federal hiring process, the selecting official and the selecting panel serves as the jury. What might OPM do policy-wise to ensure that federal agencies assemble selecting panels, juries, if you will, that are representative peers?
Sure. So we have recommended to agencies that they look at how they formulate their panels, correct? And we have asked them to include minorities, to include women. Here's the one thing that is happening, though, to be real honest. When agencies have done this, they often will find the same 1 or 2 minorities and they keep trying to get them to serve on every panel. And it's not really having the effect that we're looking for. The other pieces, and this is probably going to be pretty interesting and surprising to folks, research shows that panels are not the most effective way to conduct interviews. Because what happens is whoever is the strongest person on the panel will be the one to sway the outcome. What they find is if you actually do it one by one, where let's say you had 20-minute interviews in a cycle of 3 for a course of an hour, you will get completely different outcomes because people look for and make different connections when it's a one-on-one experience rather than a panel. And so this is the kind of information that we're sharing. The other piece that's relatively interesting, I think it is Harvard conducted studies, and they found that if you do batch hirings, so let's say I see someone from FAA, so you know you're going to hire 1,000 air traffic controllers, you'll actually get more diversity if you try to hire the whole 1,000 and have people going through the process together than if you try to do it one by one. And they're not sure exactly what's happening there. One thing that we do know is that bias plays a role. We all have bias, implicit bias, and we do it because our brain is categorizing information quickly, and so we assume certain stereotypes to get through the information. We're working with managers and supervisors, especially hiring managers and supervisors, to learn what the bias is so they can avoid it. Not in that uncomfortable way where you go through all the terrible stereotypes, nothing like that, but just the understanding that it exists and that we sometimes use it to make decisions. And the most common bias is like me bias. Who's the smartest person you all know? You won't say it, you think it's yourself. Right? We all think that way. So when we meet people and we're interviewing people and they sound or have some similarity to ourselves, we instantly like them, which is why you'll often see workplaces where lots of people of similar types are together because you just gravitate towards each other.
So you say
that's a good question. So this last executive order, the president said that the President's Management Council would be responsible for ensuring compliance with the executive order. And so on a quarterly basis, we do share the data with them. What has been of difficulty is we're not doing as much hiring because of the recent sequestration and the budget cuts. So to give you an idea, 2013, we hired about 75,000 people, non-seasonal, full-time, permanent. That's much lower than usual. 93,000 permanent position and 120,000 for all other types of position. Believe it or not, non-seasonal, full-time, permanents are the least diverse group that gets hired. And then as you move up, you see more diversity. So those are the things that while the President's Management Council is looking, while we might even see hiring rates of 15% for Latinos, it doesn't have the impact because it's such a small number in a workforce of almost 2 million people. But even with that being said, we've put all this data for people to find on OPM's website where you can look by agency and see what the representation is, how they're doing for the different groups, attrition rates, GS levels, SES levels, because part of it is just transparency.
Right. And with that, we're going to wrap up, but I'm going to ask that Veronica stay up here, and if Judge Tagle will join me up here as well. We have a small token of appreciation for you guys being here. And again, I can't thank you guys enough for being here tonight, because this was a wonderful presentation, and I think there was a lot of food for thought for all of us. And I'm pretty sure that many of you all are quite content with what you saw here. So before we move on to the guests, please join me in giving them a round of applause. And so they have a little token with us, and just so that you know what's in them.
Is it a book?
Yes.
Oh, good.
This is the Library of Congress.
Yes.
Well, you know what? The gentleman who introduced me didn't mention that I used to be a librarian. I have a master's in library science from North Texas State University, but I went to law school. And thank you so much. This is fantastic.
It's the illustrated guide to the law library. And
Yay.
anytime you're here and you need something, please feel free to reach out to us. We're here for you. Thank you again. There's a little bit of time at the end. If you have any last-minute networking to do, please help yourself to the refreshments. The worst thing that can happen is that we have to discard any of it. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.